Hello, fantasy writers. Today I'm going to be talking to you about planning out your story idea. So, you have a brainstormed, you have started to develop your story a little bit, and today we're going to really dive deep into planning. So, today I want to teach you that once writers have a story idea full of characters and a world that you've started to develop, you take time to make a plan for how your story will go. Specifically, you come up with a compelling opening scene, an idea of how the story will end, and a clear path that goes from beginning to the end. Often, this means trying out several versions of how your story will go before deciding on the best option. So, it's important that you orient your reader to your story and how it might unfold right at the beginning. So, if we look at our read aloud, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, and we think about how J.K. Rowling sets this up, let's think about how she orients us. She says, Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Okay, so that's on page 1, and then it continues to tell a little bit more about Mr. and Mrs. Dursley. On page 2, the story continues. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign, cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. As the story continues on to page 9, Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realize he was being watched because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, I should have known. He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again, and the next lamp flickered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer, until the only lights left on the street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street toward number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall. He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape of the markings the cat had around its eyes. She, too, was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun, and she looked distinctly ruffled. So the author here is helping readers find out the time, the place, and necessary background information, right? We find out about Dumbledore, we find out Professor McGonagall, we find out where Harry lives, where the setting is taking place, and that Mr. and Mrs. Dursley do not appreciate anything out of the ordinary, which lends us to then figure out why they dislike Harry so very much. The way that J.K. Rowling sets up the beginning of Harry Potter can influence the way that you set up the beginning of your story. So on page 14, which is slide 2 of the materials attached. Slide 1 is the excerpts that I just read you. On slide 2, page 14, you're going to start to fill in what characters will you introduce right in the beginning. And I give you this note. Click inside the gray boxes to type. So you just have to double click and then you can start typing. So what characters are you going to introduce in the beginning? How are you going to bring in the setting? And how will you introduce any magical or fantastical elements? Okay, we see that in the beginning, who does J.K. Rowling introduce to us? Well, she introduces to us Mr. And Mrs. Dursley. We also get introduced to Dumbledore. And we get introduced to McGonagall, right? How will you bring in the setting? Well, how does J.K. Rowling bring in the setting? describes the area, and it talks about street lamps. Okay, you could do that as well. And then how will you introduce any magical or fantastical elements? So we have a tabby cat reading a map, transforms into a person, and then we have the put-outer that Dumbledore uses, right? Now that's what J.K. Rowling did. You guys are going to fill this in for what you're going to do in your story. The story that you're writing, not a story you're reading, the story that you are writing in this unit. You will fill that in. If you want to pause the video right now and fill that in while it's fresh in your mind, go ahead and do that. And then just come back to the video. The next thing you want to do is to think about how a story ends. So in Paperback Princess, this is how this story ends. Elizabeth walked right over the dragon and opened the door to the cave. There was Prince Ronald. He looked at her and said, "Elizabeth, you are a mess. You smell like ashes. Your hair is all tangled and you're wearing a dirty old paper bag. Come back when you're dressed like a real princess." "Ronald," said Elizabeth, "your clothes are really pretty and your hair is very neat. You look like a real prince, but you are a bum." And they didn't get married after all. So the author here closes out the story kind of humorously. So how are you going to close out your story? Again, this spot, or you could fill this in, right? How does the author help readers have closure at the end of this story? And then you will double click in the gray boxes to type, how will you end your story? What characters will be in your ending? Where will the ending take place? And what final thoughts will you want to make sure you bring forward? So in Paperback Princess, who's there? The princess and the, or Elizabeth and the prince, right? Where will the ending take place? If it takes place outside of the door. What final thoughts? That the author really wants us to know in Paperback Princess that clothes don't make you any better of a person, right? So what thought do you want to leave with your readers? Then you want to start thinking about, how is your story going to go? What's the first event or the conflict? What's the second event, third and fourth, and so on? And that is when you are planning out your plot. Okay, so event 1, conflict or complications are just introduced here, usually. Event 2, event 3, and event 4. You don't really want to have any more huge events as part of your story because, again, we're not writing a novel. You're just kind of writing a short story. The last thing, and you can pause the video, guys, anytime and rewatch, or pause the video, fill in that slide, and then come back. The last thing that you might want to do is dive deeper into your story and think not only about the actual events, but the internal storyline as well. So the learning journey that your character takes. You can try this out on page 19, which is the last slide here. Let me give you guys a little note. And I'm going to say that this page is optional. Fill in if you want to dive deeper into the internal story of your characters. And some of you may find that when you do that, it helps you understand where you want your story to go a little bit more. Okay, but that is completely up to you. All right, my writers, that is all I have for you today. Remember that you should be filling in all of these slides in the gray boxes for the story that you are writing, that you've started to brainstorm. If you fill this in, then next week when we start to flash draft, you are going to have a way easier time because you're going to have a lot of your story kind of figured out. I really cannot look forward even more. Like, I'm so excited to read your stories and see what fantastical worlds you are creating. Happy writing!